Given your own criticism of the government's handling of the banking inquiry in the last week or so, do you think now, with Stephen Donnelly's resignation, it's time to just end the whole thing and kick it into touch?
No, I don't, because I've long felt that there should be a parliamentary inquiry into what happened in this country, into the collapse of the banking system and the resultant economic collapse. I think that it should be done by the Parliament, by the Oireachtas, the Dáil and Senate. And I think there's a huge need for, even though we've had the 3 banking reports, I think there's a real need to have public hearings. So there's a public account given by people who were responsible for certain events and who took certain decisions or failed to make other decisions. And I think it's appropriate that should be done in the Parliament. I think, with good TV, radio and online coverage, so that people can actually, themselves witness the accounts that are given.
I think it's a complete mess now.
I think last week was a bit of a mess. I think it was a really unfortunate turn of events, to put it mildly. I've already said that I think that when the decision was made in the Senate committee in respect of the members, the appointment of the 2 members, I think it probably should have been left at that. That would have been my sense of it. But now it's moved on and a decision has been made. Well, yeah, I think it's a pity that Stephen Donnelly has quit. I presume he'll be replaced by one of his colleagues from the technical group, because it is important that the inquiry is representative of all strands of opinion in the Dáil and Shannon. But it's not been a good episode, and I suppose it's not the best possible start to the inquiry.
This and your comments in relation to the Garda Commissioner's retirement, you were quite outspoken on both those issues in the last couple of weeks. And yet you've said nothing against the government or against what the coalition has been doing in the last 2 years as a minister. Is this just a ploy to win votes? No, well, when the issue of the Callanan departure happened, we would have had our own discussion internally in the party, and in fact, although I make a habit of not repeating what I or other people said at the parliamentary party, but I will, for the purpose of answering your question, tell you that I did actually raise it in the parliamentary party at the time. And I think a lot of people in the party and elsewhere were very concerned, particularly about the fact that the Taoiseach does not appear to have been wasn't kept informed about what happened that day. And that was the context in which I raised this 2 weeks ago in my letter to party members, was about not so much the issue itself, although the issue is the reason why obviously was the point that we were discussing, but it was the fact that the notion that the Taoiseach, the head of one of the partner parties in government, would not be involved in discussions on major decisions such as that, or decisions that were being contemplated, or even discussion on an issue like that, I think is completely unacceptable. That was the point I was making to the members. But if you ask me, had I just suddenly woken up to that question a couple of weeks ago? No. I mean, I certainly had raised it, and other people had within the party at the time. Okay. Do you think Martin Callanan was sacked by the Taoiseach? Well, I'm waiting, as everybody else is, for the Taoiseach to give. It's impossible to make a final judgment on that until we see what the Taoiseach's account is. But it certainly looks to me that there was a certain train of events that day. I mean, the Commissioner was in office on the Monday and wasn't on the Tuesday, and the only intervening event was the visit that he had from the Secretary-General of the Department of Justice. So there's definitely an explanation required, at least, as to what occurred and what was said and what led to the Commissioner's decision on the Tuesday morning. A reasonable person would make the assumption that he was sacked, or he was told to go. I think a reasonable person could come to that conclusion based on the facts that are available to the reasonable person at this time. But what we need now is the full account from the Taoiseach, and the Taoiseach has said he will give that full account. I'm not really hung up on where he gives that account, but I think he should do so, and this matter really should be resolved and should be dealt with. Okay. Are you not ignoring the electorate, the Labour Party, surely the message from the electorate in the last election was you guys need to pull out of government because otherwise your support will dwindle even further? Well, I suppose we could, people could make the case that we should pull out of government. If we were to pull out of government, we could achieve absolutely nothing. In opposition, you can scrutinise. In opposition, you can pressurise. In opposition, you can campaign. But you can't actually achieve anything really ultimately of substance. And I believe we've achieved a huge amount in the last 3 years. I mean, I think the notion that the Labour Party should stay pure and stay away from the dangerous business of government, I've never agreed with. At least
not agreed with it as an article of faith. I mean, sometimes it is proper to be in opposition and to choose to say, look, we're not going to go into government because we can't get agreement with people to go into government. But I think we did the right thing in 2011. And I think we're doing the right thing staying there for as long as we can see the opportunity to implement the kind of policy that we want to see implemented. And of course, people have reacted against stuff that has happened. And even using that phrase sounds like I'm diminishing it, because it's been a huge impact on people. Decisions have been made by this government, including by, with our participation. But I think we've now reached a stage where we can see a better prospect for in the next two budgets. I think that the financial and revenue situation means that we can have a budget this year that doesn't actually impose any more austerity and doesn't actually impose any more charges and actually doesn't impose any more cuts in public spending, which are the kind of things that have affected our core support, and which has in many cases meant that people have lost trust in us. Yeah. And I think we do have some rebuilding to do, to say the least. I think it's been a combination of a whole lot of different things. I mean, talking to people on the proverbial doorstep and on the actual doorstep, it's just, there's a weariness of a sheer combination of things: additional charges, property tax, water, all of the cuts that have taken place in health, in welfare, social protection, in education. There's a combination of a whole number of different factors, I think, that people have just grown completely weary of it. I don't think there's a single decision.
There's a lot of people who've been in touch with us who said, why only now are the Labour Party beginning to listen to the electorate? I mean, for 3 years you voted through all of those cuts and taxes that you've talked about, and only now you start listening. Like, I mean, it diminishes people's respect in politics, I think, because they think that the only way politicians listen is when they get a good kicking at the ballot box.
It's a harsh criticism, and I think it's one that we have to take. I think it's not unfair for people to take that view, that look, you don't seem to have responded until we told you. But I would say in our defence, genuinely, that we have listened, and we do listen. As politicians, as practicing politicians, we're in contact with voters all the time and with constituents all the time. We understand the effect that decisions have had on people, decisions that have had to be made, from the word go when the government was formed in 2011. So I think that we haven't been good enough at benchmarking what we're doing against our basic principles, which is to try to protect public services and to ensure that working people don't bear the brunt of austerity and of the economic collapse. And I think that in large measure we have succeeded in protecting particularly people who depend on welfare, depend on social protection. We have succeeded in doing that. But there's an awful lot of people in what's sometimes described as the middle, who see themselves as having to pay for an awful lot, and perhaps they're don't get the benefits that they think they should get. And I think we haven't spoken to people as clearly as we should have about what we're doing and why we're doing it.
Austerity, a lot of people have asked, how has austerity affected you personally over the last 3 years?
Well, I'm a public servant and I'm married to a public servant. We've both taken pay reductions, pretty substantial pay reductions. We're both, relatively speaking, well-paid public servants, so we've taken pay cuts. So there are two earners in the family, and both salaries have been cut with the same kind of percentage that people will be familiar with across the public sector. So in that sense, it's been affected. We're not. Because we're relatively well paid in our family, we don't rely on public services to the extent that other people do. So I would accept, like, people on low pay or people on no pay rely much more on, for example, health services and other services across the board that they can't, directly afford themselves. So that hasn't impacted us. But we have taken pay cuts.
I mean, you're very well paid, and you're in a government which is making decisions that impact on people who actually rely on these public services. I mean, something like child benefit.
Yeah.
Like, you voted to cut that.
Yeah. It does bother me. Yeah. It does bother me that,
why not take a more substantial pay cut, perhaps?
Because I think we have taken substantial pay cuts. I think the pay cuts in the public service have been substantial, and they've been higher at the higher level. They've been proportionately higher at the higher level, which is only right. So I think that certainly has happened. It does bother me. Many of the decisions that we voted for bothered me at the time and still bother me.
And yet you did them.
We did them because we did them in order to ensure that we didn't have to do worse things, and that a government that wouldn't include the Labour Party wouldn't have done far worse things. I mean, I believe that the extent of cuts in public services would have been much more severe if we weren't in that government, to the order of 2 billion or more. cuts across the public sector would have been. I don't believe that you would have had a proper public service pay deal if the Labour Party wasn't there. I think there are a huge number of things that have actually, been good, if it's a relative term in an economic crisis, but there were decisions that were made in a particular direction that were done so because we were there. And it's harder to explain that because a part of I suppose, the narrative is and the truth of it is that if the Labour Party hadn't been in this government, I think that the situation facing working people in this country would be considerably worse under any other combination of parties in Dáil Éireann, in my view. Well, preferably in government, but we have to be a fighting force after the next election to have the opportunity to participate in a government, and we have to find people willing to come to an agreement with us after the election along the lines that we would see as being necessary for the country. But the main thing I would see for the party in 5 years' time is that we'd be recovered and that we would have renewed our base, renewed our own organisation, and I think continue to be the sort of really critical, I would say indispensable force in Irish politics that we've been for 100 years.
We talk about recovery. I mean, is recovery to the level of 2011 when you got a record number of seats, or is recovery just getting back to that kind of 10-12% that Labour has always been at?
Well, I suppose I wouldn't like to put actual numbers on it because it'd be hung around my neck, but I think certainly there it's fair what you're saying. I mean, I think I would see this in a progressive way. I think that the 7% that we got in the local elections is a shockingly low result. I think that we can and must lift that at a minimum back to where we were in recent elections, which, as you say, was 10-11%. That's a minimum, an absolute minimum objective that I have in the short term. In the short term, I think that it is possible to envisage us getting back to the kind of support levels that we had in 2011, but we've some distance to travel in that regard. Well, you see, much as I'd like to be helpful, you can't really give it out, because if you did in fact have an actual red line issue and you gave it, you've completely removed any sort of negotiating room that you would have. I mean, what I would say is this, though.
But you see, people see Labour as the party that broke all those promises, the Every Little Hurts leaflet. So people will think that you have to make promises of some sort and you have to actually keep them this time.
I don't accept that we broke all our promises. If you look at our manifesto in 2011 and you look what we said we would do in terms of the public finances, in terms of protecting public service, in terms of the privatisation agenda of other parties, in terms of a whole raft of different issues, including the reform agenda, I do not accept that we're the party of broken promises as it has been alleged against us. I think if you take two of the high profile issues like third level education and child benefit, in particular third level education, what was said at the time was that there would be no reintroduction of tuition fees, and then there would be no increase in the administration charge. Now, the second one wasn't possible to deliver. The first one has been delivered. We haven't had a reintroduction of tuition fees, but we only got 19% of the vote. I mean, we went to the electorate on a manifesto asking people to vote for us based on our manifesto, and they didn't vote for us. Like 81% of the population voted against the Labour Party. So the programme for government is not the Labour Party manifesto, because we only got 19% of the electorate and our partners in government got double that. So I think we need to be clearer on that. You can talk about the newspaper ads and various other things that were said in the course of election. Well, I think the ad itself was in the last few days of the campaign. It was in the final sort of cut and thrust of the few days leading up to the actual election itself. It was a quick call, I imagine. Looking back at it now, you could certainly argue that it was a mistake. At the time, you're in the cut and thrust of a campaign. I'm not going to second guess people at this remove in terms of they were doing a good job for the party. And I think ultimately what you need to look at if you're asking the question about promises is, what do we say in our manifesto? That's what parties go to the country on. And I don't believe that we broke promises in anything like the level has been suggested against us.
Okay. What three policies would be kind of priority for you in the next 2 years or however long is left? What are the most committed policies in terms of making them legislation?
For me, three, I would say, first of all, on the economic side, I mean, we could talk about the budget. I mean, the budget is sort of a dynamic thing between now and October. I mean, I don't believe that it would be necessary for us to have an adjustment of anything like 2 billion. I think we can keep to the 3%. So that's the budgetary issue. But I say on a wider economic objective will be the Strategic Investment Fund. I want to get that running, get that absolutely bedded down now this year and get it moving so that we can get investment into the economy. That would be the first. The second would be universal primary care. I remain absolutely and resolutely committed to the necessity to have a universal system of access to GP services and to primary care, not as some kind of a political sop, as is often suggested, but because it is the only way in this country, no matter who's in government, it is the only way that we'll be able to fund the health services that we need for the coming generations, is that we have a proper system of primary care, and you can only do that if you have universal access. And the third issue for me would be to round off, as it were, what's called the reform agenda. We had the Constitutional Convention, which is one of the real success stories, I think, of this government, and a lot of people said that, accepted that, even our critics. I think that the recommendations should be brought forward. Quick decisions should be made. For example, the referendum on same-sex marriage should be brought forward as an absolute priority and put to the people. And I think that amount of work that's come out of the convention should be completed. My own personal view is that the Constitutional Convention was a success, and we should consider reviving it. But we should let's first of all deal with what they've recommended. So reform, the universal primary care, and the strategic investment bank. Well, I have ministerial responsibility in that area, and I must say I understand the case that's made for it, and I keep a very close eye on what's happening internationally, particularly in the States and in South America. And I think there are some interesting debates that have emerged, particularly in South America, in relation to this. I don't think that we can be in a position in this country to go for full legalisation. I think that you know, if I talk to people involved in the services, in the psychiatric services, and in the addiction service and support services, and there's a pretty strong view there that it would be a bad idea. The kind of cannabis that's available in Ireland now is, in many cases, is an awful lot stronger than what would have been, you know, what people would have partaken in the colleges and so on in the 70s and 80s when I was a student. There's a lot of really, you know, really very, very dangerous stuff out on the streets. So the notion of legalising that, I would find, you know, abhorrent, to be honest with you. But I think that we should maintain an open mind towards international developments. We have responsibility under the conventions in relation to the control of drugs, but we shouldn't close our minds to developments or what's happening overseas, and I've certainly kept a close watch on that, and will continue to do so.
I have to ask, did you partake when you were in college?
I did.
Much?
No.
Did it hurt your feelings when Joan Burton couldn't make the same commitment as you could to including her in cabinet?
No.
It's not very nice.
My feelings, pardon?
It's not very nice.
Look,
you made a commitment to include her.
I really would not be critical of her on any of on that score. You know, I mean, she's got to address these issues in the way she sees fit. You know, I mean, I'm not hurt. I've pretty thick skin, and I certainly wasn't hurt by that. There's other things that might hurt me, not from Joan, but that didn't.
Last question: who's going to win the World Cup?
Germany, I hope.
What's your keepy uppy record?
It's very poor.
2, 3, 4?
I doubt if we'll get to 4.
Alex White, thank you very much.